Silent Hill is an interesting franchise full of mystery, both in and outside of the games. A revolutionary franchise that spawned some of the best and most influential horror games ever. Yet despite this, it was pretty much abandoned by Konami for almost a decade. But now that they remembered about it, put out the short message and announced 3 more games as well as another movie, the franchise seems to be getting some life again. As a fan, I am incredibly happy about this, but also skeptical. The movie, Return to Silent Hill, is gonna be directed by the same person who made the first Silent Hill movies, so I have no doubts that I will love it. And I don't have much to say about Townfall yet, but Silent Hill F, the next mainline game, is being developed by the studio that made Resident Evil Resistance and Reverse, 2 of the most hated games in the entire Resident Evil franchise. And while the Silent Hill 2 remake trailers don't look horrible, I'm also worried about that one, since it's trying to remake my favorite game ever. I will of course play it, but I'm worried. And excited. I hope it's gonna be good. But for now, with its release on the horizon, I decided to check out some lesser known games in the franchise. I am Jen, and today I will talk about obscure Silent Hill games, starting with Silent Hill Orphan. Released in 2007, this mobile game actually tries to be survival horror. Though of course that wouldn't be possible on a platform this limited, so it's a first-person point-and-click adventure instead. And honestly, that works surprisingly well. So let's take a closer look. The first thing we notice after selecting the language is... yeah, that's pretty much the extent of music in this game. And this same track also plays during gameplay sometimes, and trust me, it doesn't get any less obnoxious. That aside, you get a few sound effects like shooting here and there, but most of the game is actually completely silent. After encountering that music for the first time, we get the tutorial and a bit of story. We play as Ben, a survivor of a mass killing at his old orphanage 30 years ago, but for some reason he had an urge to come back? Sounds like a Silent Hill premise to me. While exploring, he encounters weird things like voices he hears, a man-sized hole in the wall covered by a grandfather clock, both of which he can't remember, and of course the other world. The story is actually pretty interesting, and I think about as good as it can get for such a limited platform. It's full of little twists and mysteries that I didn't expect and that had me guessing how they would be resolved. Like for example, Ben explaining that he was in the shower room while everyone was killed, but he can't remember why? And we can't enter the shower room because he feels like something bad would happen if we did? What's up with that? And there were more mysteries too, and all of them were genuinely interesting. It may not be the best story in this series, but surprisingly it's not the worst one either. And so we walk around the orphanage, solve puzzles, kill monsters, and try to uncover the mystery. What exactly happened here, and why did Ben decide to come back? The gameplay is pretty rudimentary, which is fair considering the platform and genre. It being a point-and-click adventure, you explore the areas, inspect things, pick up items, and generally just interact with things by clicking on them. You always have 4 options: look at, take or interact, taste or talk to, and check inventory, which, by the way, is the only way to check your inventory. Why? You sometimes get notes that you can only read by accessing your inventory, but in order to do that you have to interact with something? That's kinda dumb. And what about that tasting talking thing? You can try to lick everything, but by design this whole mechanic is used exactly once in this entire game, making me wonder why it exists in the first place. That aside, you also have to fight enemies sometimes, which is pretty basic and serves its purpose. The only problem here is that they all look the same, including the final boss. Though at least it's an original design, and not even a bad one. I just would have liked a little more variety, and while I'm at it, a little less predictability, because their locations aren't random, and after the first encounter, it's usually pretty easy to guess where they are. The last bit of gameplay is movement. It's pretty self-explanatory. You click wherever you want to go, including back. And you have to go back pretty often, which would be fine if the cursor didn't always start in the middle. So if you want to go back a lot, which you sometimes have to, especially if you don't know what to do, you always have to move it down, push, move down, push, move down. It's a little tiring. I did appreciate having to grab something out of a toilet though, giving me some real Silent Hill 2 flashbacks. But let's get back to the orphanage. The map, despite having 3 floors, is kinda small, but it's enough for the story it's trying to tell, and I'm glad that the game acknowledged how small it is, and actually explains that there were only 12 kids who still had to split into 2 groups when eating because the dining table wasn't big enough. That makes the whole place feel much more realistic, and depressing honestly. And in general, it seemed to be pretty miserable there. No personal belongings, no privacy even in the bathrooms, like damn. It's pretty well designed in my opinion, feeling almost like a haunted, lost place, and I love the creativity of having an orphanage as the main location of a game. We haven't really had that in survival horror before, and it's adapted beautifully. But looking at the map itself, there is one thing that kinda bothered me. All the passages are marked on the map from the beginning. In all other Silent Hill games, your map is empty, and as you explore and discover blocked paths, open doors, and other important things, your character will mark them on the map. That increases immersion a lot and gives the map much more meaning. All that is gone here. I knew right away which doors I can and can't go through, most of the time at least, because sometimes the things the map tells you aren't even true. Like this door, which is actually blocked despite the map telling you it's open, and it doesn't change even after you discover that it's blocked. And while I'm at it, what are these random blocked doors? Wouldn't it make sense for a map that I picked up on the ground floor of the orphanage to show all the rooms in the orphanage? Like, they don't have to be accessible, but it would have helped immersion to actually show them. As a Silent Hill fan, things like these feel like no-brainers. The map is an integral part in most of the games, including this one, and it's a bit of a shame that it wasn't integrated into gameplay in the same way. What was integrated into gameplay though, and can be seen as a problem because of that, is the other world. Just like in Silent Hill Origins, you can switch back and forth anytime by staring at the halo of the sun, and much like in Origins, the other world feels a bit like a puzzle element and not like an important story device sometimes. In the other games, as far as the characters are concerned, the world switches at random, it changes everything and you can't just leave, you have to push through. That makes the whole thing feel meaningful, whereas in Origins, it was turned into a pure puzzle element that you can switch to and from at any time. Go here, go to the other world, that opens up this path, then you can go back to the normal world here. It's by far not as bad in Orphan, and actually does feel meaningful in the second half, but in the first half, it did sometimes feel like more of a puzzle element. I hope that makes sense. But everything else the other world has to offer is beyond amazing in my opinion. It looks great, the normal orphanage feeling like a haunted place with some history, while the other world feels like a more twisted and in-your-face version of that, as it should. With puzzles, enemies, creepy environments, the whole package. Predictable enemy placements aside, they really outdid themselves here. Now, taking all of this into account, how did I find the game? It should be clear by now that it's far from perfect. There are things to criticize, and I mentioned many of them. But I'm not sure if I was able to bring across just how charming it really is. How amazing the locations look, and how interesting I found the story. Playing it was honestly a bit of a joy. Would I recommend it to literally anyone ever? No. But do I regret a single second I spent with it? Also no. Maybe it's just the feeling of playing something obscure within a bigger franchise, which I love. But I did have fun with it. So if you can look past the limitations, maybe this is something for you. It certainly was an interesting experience, and pretty short too. The only real problem is that it ends on a cliffhanger, so f me I guess. The next game is Silent Hill DX. Released in 2006, this is the first ever Silent Hill mobile game, and probably the most obscure game of the entire franchise. It's actually just called Silent Hill and is referred to as mobile in the overview thingy of the wiki, but fans have come to call it Silent Hill DX because it released on Konami's mobile game service from back in the day, called Konami Net DX. It's sort of a visual novel adaptation of the first game, kinda like Play Novel, but arguably more complex? Not in terms of puzzles, but the gameplay is actually closer to a JRPG with random turn-based monster encounters. Isn't it crazy that the story of the first game is actually the story of 4 different games, and 2 of them are visual novels for portable devices? Anyway, this one was never released in English, and these days only the Chinese version seems to exist, and I sadly don't know Chinese. There is a fan translation, but the port is really bad and I only managed to get a few screens in, so this is sadly where my journey with this one already ends. I genuinely tried my best, and getting this far was already kind of a headache, but I also didn't want to not mention it, simply because it's borderline lost media at this point. But I did find this video from earlier this year where someone actually played and reviewed it in detail. And it includes some of the only gameplay I was able to find, and as he himself says in the video, possibly the first gameplay footage of this game on the internet ever. I would have loved to play it myself, but this is the next best thing I guess. And it's a good video, I'll link it in the description. But if anyone wants to have a go at translating the Chinese version and properly porting it, be my guest. I would love to actually play it myself. So, remember when I said that Silent Hill DX is referred to as mobile on the wiki? Well, here we have Silent Hill Mobile too. Except it's not a sequel to DX, it's a sequel to Orphan, released almost 1 year later. Amazing, right? Why they bother changing the name is beyond me. It doesn't take place at an orphanage anymore, I guess, but it is a direct sequel, and the orphans are still very much at the center of the story. Anyway, I'm just happy that the first game's cliffhanger was resolved after all, but let's start from the beginning. We are again greeted by the tutorial, and see that the one pointless interaction method, the mouth, is gone. The only other gameplay tweak, by the way, is that you can now turn left, right and back, instead of only ever facing one direction. In the corridors at least, not in the rooms. The rest is the exact same, down to the need to interact with something in order to access your inventory and read unrelated notes. I will never get over this. After the tutorial, you wake up in this bland, grey changing room as Lucas, a previously unknown character. You don't remember anything, but a certain Karen, a character from the first game, is talking to you telepathically. She's trying to make you remember, telling you things like your name, and speaks to you throughout the whole game. Your goal is to figure out what is going on, who you are, and what exactly Karen wants. And to do that, you go through this hospital, look for clues, solve puzzles, and fight enemies. A true Silent Hill game, you might say. But one thing disappointed me right off the bat. Why a hospital? The orphanage was such a cool and creative setting. The only other Silent Hill game to feature one is the fourth one, and you're only there for like a minute. So having it as the main setting in Silent Hill Orphan was super interesting, and I hoped for more of that or other creative settings. But hospitals are extremely common in the franchise, and this isn't even one we know, making me wonder just how many this town has. Also, why is it so tiny? At least with the orphanage the small size was explained, but a hospital? I'm not sure if it would be possible to explain that at all, but they didn't even try. And to then make it look this bland on top of that? I mean, all the corridors look the same. Even in the other world, they only got a reddish filter and nothing else changes. I really didn't like that. But at least the rooms here look really good, especially the first one with the dripping blood. They really outdid themselves here. By the way, you can enter the other world at any point again, except this time it's by staring at an upside down triangle? And the other world actually feels meaningful in this game. At no point did I think of it as a pure puzzle device, despite the ability to switch anytime. No idea how they managed that, but it's really cool. And so is the music compared to the first game at least. Not only do you get more tracks, most of them are actually okay. Nothing too special in its own, but given the first game's terrible sound design, it was very refreshing. Don't get me wrong, most of the game is still silent, but whenever you do get to hear some music, it's always different and always better than in the first game. The only track I didn't like is the one that plays when you switch back to the normal world. And not only does the game have more music, it also has more puzzles. Way more. I like that. Though there are sadly also some I didn't understand even after looking them up. Best case scenario would of course be to understand all of them, but I'd still take this over no puzzles. It just made it feel more like a survival horror game. Just like the battles. There are only 4 enemies in this entire game, 3 normal ones and the final boss, but the normal ones appear at such random places where you had just been before that they were way more unpredictable here. And I also like the abundance of locked doors, or generally things I had to find other things for to be able to progress. The map was also improved. While it is again completely marked from the beginning and doesn't change even when you open locked doors, and while having less accessible rooms than the first game, this one manages to feel bigger simply because there are more rooms on the map, even though you never even enter half of them. Having them on the map increases the perceived scale and immersion, and then some of the ones you do get to enter are also locked at first and often tied to puzzles for which you need other items or hints from other places. This is something the first game really lacked and I loved it. The only thing I didn't understand about the map is this dead end. And this one. But overall, everything about this game managed to feel even more like survival horror than the first one did. And by the time you reach the end, you will see that the story took a very different turn than you would expect. Arguably a more twisted one, with one of the plot points being someone trying to revive the murdered children from the orphanage. That was something. And it ends on a cliffhanger again, making me really excited for the third and last game. At this point I was so much into the story that I just needed to know how it concludes. Yet despite all of this, Silent Hill Mobile 2 left a bit of a bitter taste. The more generic setting and all the hallways looking the same, including in the other world, kinda bothered me. And that the normal world rooms look so bland, and that the story, while being an interesting and meaningful middle chapter, just doesn't have that sense of mystery the first game had. It's very twisted and takes turns you wouldn't expect, but the premise is amnesia, while the premise of the first game is a survivor of a mass killing returning to the orphanage where it happened 3 decades later. It's just much more intriguing and less cliché. And the first game also had more twists, and didn't go as over the top, still staying believable for a Silent Hill story, which I can't exactly say here. This one goes full supernatural, and I just didn't like that as much, on top of this game being noticeably shorter. The puzzles were more interesting here, and I liked the battles more, and the music. I liked playing it more, but there is more to a game than gameplay, and overall, I still prefer the first one. So let's see what the third and last one has to offer. But first, let's take another detour and check out Silent Hill: The Escape. This game released for this thing in 2007, iPhones in 2008, and Android in South Korea only in 2010, which is the version I'm playing. I would have loved to play the iPhone version, but emulating those is kinda impossible, so I'm stuck on my dad's old Samsung Galaxy S4 because it wouldn't run on my modern phone. Look at this thing, what did he do with it? Anyway, Silent Hill: The Escape is a first-person dungeon crawler with an extensive tutorial, but it's in Korean. Luckily it's a pretty simple game, so I was able to figure out everything on my own. Or alternatively, you can hop right into the first level. There are a total of 10 proper levels, and gameplay is pretty simple. You have to find a key and then go to the exit, which is always marked on the map. In true dungeon crawler fashion, you can only look in 4 directions and only move in the direction you're facing, or back. The on-screen D-pad appears whenever you touch the screen and is used by swiping and holding in one direction. But you can also look around a little within the direction, which is done with the phone's gyro sensor. Yeah. This game is from the time when companies loved to experiment with the new possibilities of smartphones and often didn't understand how to make features comfortable or even fun to use. And in the case of this game, there are a few issues with the gyro sensor, who would have thought. First up, it defaults to this 45-degree angle, so you always have to look down when playing it. I'm sure that's good for your neck. And on top of that, it flips left and right by default? And then has the nerve to call that normal? But at least you can change it. Secondly, the gyro sensor is extremely sensitive and doesn't filter out any movement, no matter how small. So if your hands shake even a little, gameplay will be a little shaky too, which can cause a little bit of nausea if it gets stronger. So a lot of the time I actively had to try and keep my hands extra steady, even though they're not even shaky to begin with, simply because there would be noticeable micro movements all the time. And lastly, shooting is done by tapping the middle of the screen, and putting your thumb there will A, cover the enemy you wanna shoot, and B, make your hands move a little. And with the gyro sensor being this sensitive, you can actually miss shots and not even see it until you put your finger away, and then you have to try again. These things don't make Silent Hill: The Escape a horrible experience, but definitely not a good one either. It's very obviously an early smartphone game, and those were often hit and miss, and in this case, it's sadly more of a miss. That aside, there are 2 more things I quickly want to mention about gameplay. One, pausing is done by tapping the map for some reason, and whenever you do, the background shakes a little, which gets stronger the more you move your phone right before pausing, so make sure to put it on the table before pausing it. And 2, reloading is done using the gyro sensor too, and actually works really well. You have to line up the revolver drum, and the more accurate you are, the more bullets you reload. I like that because it can make stressful situations even more stressful, and suddenly you only have 3 bullets in your drum instead of 5. Speaking of reloading and shooting, there are actually a bunch of different enemy types and all of them behave differently. That was super interesting because I kind of expected them to be glorified reskins, but no. The only thing they have in common is that they kill you with 1 shot, and it never felt like any of them were used too much or too little either. I like that. You have some from previous games, like obviously the Bubblehead Nurses and Pyramid Head, but also a few original ones. Personally, I would have preferred only original ones, including an original nurse design, since nurses are very common throughout the franchise but always look different, but I understand why they put in some of the classics. Well, most of them at least. Though I have to say, these wheelchairs with their squeaking noises were actually quite creepy sometimes. And in general, the sound design isn't horrible in this game. The only annoying one is the radio that always plays. And I really do mean always, to the point where it got obnoxious pretty quickly. In true Silent Hill fashion, it gets louder when enemies are nearby, which is cool, but does it really have to play all the time? On top of that, once enemies are really close, the danger sign pops up. Problem is though, that these things also work through walls, so not always useful. But that aside, we have sounds like the steps from the nurses, the squeaking of the wheelchairs, shooting, the exit opening, and so on. My favorite is the absolute classic that plays when picking up the battery. The only other item in this game, and honestly I still don't know what it does. I would have preferred some ammo because it is possible to run out, and when you do, you switch to a pretty useless pipe. Anyway, while there is sadly no background music, most of the sounds in this game are pretty good, and combined with the environments actually make for a pretty creepy atmosphere. This almost backrooms-esque design of a dungeon crawler, but with normal walls and boarded up doors and such, was just uncanny. The environments feel surprisingly natural for such a game. You get 5 different ones and their respective otherworld versions, which always seem to use the same map as the normal versions, but items spawn and exit are in different locations. And there are now fences blocking some paths, but sadly without being marked on the map, even after seeing or walking into them. Design-wise, the otherworld looks really good at first, but felt a little uninspired later on because it didn't surprise me anymore. Each level gets the same kinds of changes, mostly bloody walls, so I came to expect them pretty quickly. A bit of a shame if you ask me. They could have gotten more creative here. Same for the story. It's extremely minimal, with only a bit of flavor text before every level. And despite the fact that I wasn't really able to put it together, sometimes the automatic translation kinda made sense, sometimes not at all, I can't imagine that a few short sentences before every level make for a deep story. This one is more or less a pure arcade game that tries to encourage replayability by giving you a score at the end of each level. Killing fewer enemies, higher accuracy, taking less time, and walking a smaller distance all increase your score. And item and enemy placements are always the same, so you can try and get the highest score by planning your routes carefully. That's pretty neat in my opinion, but can also decrease replayability for people who would like to just play the maps with random placements. Especially since getting high scores doesn't unlock anything as far as I know, so it's really just for the personal achievement. I don't know, double-edged sword I guess. Overall, this is not a bad game. It's very clear to me that the developers really tried to make it as creepy and good as they could, with the sound design, environments, and their attempt at an immersive control scheme. They genuinely tried their best, but in doing so, kinda forgot to make the game fun to play. But they also didn't want to give up their new and experimental control scheme, and the genre they chose for some reason. All that, while not horrible, sadly makes for a mediocre experience at best. And after you finish it, you get the alien ending and an ominous to be continued. Sorry for the bad recording, but for some reason I didn't expect an ending already and hadn't properly set up my recording yet, so this is from when I built a brick set on stream. Follow me on Twitch by the way. Anyway, nice little reference to the alien endings of the main games. And the to be continued? It refers to the alien mode we just unlocked, new level selection and all. The only difference here is the weapon though. You now have a laser weapon that you have to charge to shoot, and it never runs out of ammo. The rest are the exact same levels with the exact same item, key, and enemy placements. That, combined with the unlimited ammo, makes for an easier and faster experience, especially if you play it right after human mode. But it being the exact same game again that you have to play in its entirety rather than just unlocking the new weapon did sour my experience a little. Once you finish the game for the second time, you get another nice reference to the secret endings from the main games, the dog ending, and dog mode. As with alien mode, it's the same thing again, except now I'm small, and the crosshair is this cute dog nose and mouth, and you attack by biting. And not only do your attacks make you bark and you have this super cute animation, they also change the dynamic a bit because, despite the range being surprisingly high, it's still less than with a handgun, leading me to avoid fights more. And instead of the radio, you now only hear yourself, so you never even know when you're getting closer to enemies. That made me approach the whole game in a bit of a different way, more careful you could say. Except with Pyramid Head. That thing is really easy to beat here. I like dog mode as an unlockable more than alien mode, because it actually changes the game in a meaningful way and doesn't just give you a better weapon. And once you get through all the levels, you get an ending with these 3 weird things from the tutorial, and the game tells you it's over. That's it. I liked experiencing yet another game from one of my favorite franchises. Of course you can't compare it to the main games. It doesn't try to tell a story or to impress with deep mechanics. It tries to be a fun and creepy little dungeon crawler. I don't think I would ever recommend it to anyone. There is simply no reason to. But I found it interesting to play, and the novelty of playing a Silent Hill game nobody has even heard of kinda makes it worth it for me. It's not the greatest game ever, it's not even all that good. But in sort of a guilty pleasure way, I just can't hate it. It has some weird charm to it. But you know what? There is a remake. Yes, really. A fan actually decided to remake it for PC as part of a game jam. And under these circumstances, it's understandable that it doesn't look perfect. But that aside, it's a very faithful adaptation that works extremely well. You literally just install and play it. No need to fiddle around with settings or anything like that. So in terms of actually playing Silent Hill: The Escape, this is about as good as it gets. But how does it compare to the original? Instead of a gyro sensor, you now obviously use the mouse to look around and reload, and it feels good. Just based on that alone, this game already feels better to play than the original. Interestingly, we can reload up to 6 bullets here instead of 5, and the battery pickup was replaced by ammo, so we also get more bullets per level, and on top of that, there seem to be less enemies around, so needless to say, I never ran out of ammo. But if you somehow manage to run out, that's it, no pipe for you, good luck. But less enemies also means easier levels, and the good control scheme means quicker and more intuitive movement, which in turn makes the game more fun. But at the same time, these things, combined with the much faster movement, make it much shorter than the original. My 3 playthroughs here only took about an hour in total, while in the original my first playthrough took 1.5. The additional modes are the same here, except you don't need to charge your laser gun anymore, making it even easier. And the dog now seems to have less range but a bit more damage. And you can attract enemies with your barks now, that way you can kill them while they still try to get to you, because your range is higher than theirs. Also, as the dog you can actually walk backwards. I don't know why, but if you press back in normal or alien mode, you just turn around in this game. And the ending is also different in dog mode. This game, in contrary to the original, doesn't have a tutorial, so these things which only showed up in the tutorial and the last ending aren't a thing here. Instead you get the bunny ending. And apparently this version has 4 endings? But I have no idea how to trigger the last one. I don't even know if the original has 4 endings too. I tried replaying the whole dog mode, because the remake for some reason doesn't have a level selection, only a continue button, and got the same rabbit ending again. So after a total of 7 Silent Hill the Escape playthroughs, I was starting to get tired of it and gave up on looking for the last ending. Except hi, Jen from the future here. While trying to record gameplay, I kept running into these weird things, so I decided to do another full playthrough where I pick all of them up. Except sometimes ones I'd seen before wouldn't spawn and I didn't know what affected that, and without a level selection it's kind of a pain to reach, say, level 5 just to see if that thing is still there. Also, it didn't appear in some levels at all, and I don't know if it's by design or if I did something wrong. I even went as far as to draw out the maps just to make sure I really covered every path, but this, including my gameplay recording, was now effectively my 9th playthrough of the Escape, and by far the longest one of the remake. So, needless to say, I was kinda sick of the game by now and gave up on the search. Maybe I'll pick it back up at some point and make a follow-up short or something. It is a fun game after all. But for the time being, if anyone knows more, please let me know. I'd love to see that ending. Enemies are the same as in the original, except, as I said, these weird bubbles aren't a thing anymore, and Pyramid Head was replaced by a giant monkey? That felt so out of place. Like, if you're gonna replace the most iconic Silent Hill enemy, at least choose something scary. This was just weird. And they made it harder to beat too. Pyramid Head would always get stunned when you attacked him, which is honestly a bit out of character, but the monkey doesn't care. It's a force of nature that will get to you if you slow down while in range. Interesting choice and definitely made my dog playthrough a bit more intense. In terms of sound design, it's about the same except the radio is gone, so you have no way of knowing how close enemies are. And the danger sign on top also doesn't help, because its range is much higher than in the original. But in a way that kinda increased the horror, because enemies could be anywhere, you only know that they are somewhere close by. In the original, most of the time it was pretty clear where they are. Not sure which system I prefer, but they both feel scary in their own ways. Level design was also changed up. The maps aren't the same as in the original, but they do take inspiration and have some distinct features that resemble the original maps, which I found super interesting. Or I'm tripping and didn't realize that they are actually the same. With one exception. This game, in contrary to the original, doesn't have a dedicated tutorial, so the first level kind of acts as one instead and is very linear. But speaking of the levels, as you have seen by now, the environments don't look great. There is no variation, everything looks the same, and I don't agree with every level's design choices. And it's interesting how the barebones minimap kinda contributes to this unfinished look despite being very faithful to the original. But beyond mentioning them here, I don't actually want to bash the game's graphics too much. Again, it was developed for a game jam, and the developers even said that they still want to work on it to improve the look and add more polish. I'm just here to say both things would be nice, because I did also encounter a few small bugs here and there. The most consistent one is that pausing the game right as you get out of the elevator doesn't actually pause it. Nothing game breaking, but it's also not perfect is what I'm trying to say. Same for the fact that you can't shoot through fences anymore. You don't get many chances to, but you can do it in the original. Or the animations, they feel less detailed and less creepy overall. And the wheelchairs as enemies don't work nearly as well here as they did in the original. But of course, in the grand scheme of things, these are just nitpicks. I had a lot of fun playing this game overall, and I'm super glad that it exists at all. It's a nice and really well made little time waster. While the original is creepier, this one is actually fun to play once you get used to the tank controls, and works on modern systems without any issues. The environments are barren, Pyramid Head was replaced by a monkey, the overall game is less creepy, but I found it pretty easy to look past these things. I had fun playing this remake, and I would honestly replay it at some point, maybe even on stream. Follow me on Twitch, by the way. Of all the games so far, this is interestingly my favorite one, so make of that what you will. I'll definitely link it in the description. Released 1.5 years after Silent Hill Mobile 2, Silent Hill Mobile 3 picks up right where it left off, I think. We're playing the same character, but the cliffhanger ending left his fate unclear, so because I don't know any better and the game isn't giving me any more, I'm just gonna assume that he passed out and woke up in this mansion. Oh yeah, this game takes place in a mansion, and it has more mysteries to uncover, but mainly revelations as the story comes to a close here. No to be continued, this is it. The honestly pretty satisfying finale where all remaining questions get answered, except for one. Apparently this takes place 40 years after the murders at the orphanage? What happened in the 10 years since the first game? When does the second game take place? Does this one really pick up right after the second one? I guess we'll never know. Starting the game, we get the best intro music yet. And in general, some okay sound design. It's mostly silent again, but we get some creepy sounds sometimes, but also some more annoying ones. It's not horrible and better than the first game, but I like the second game's sound design more. Anyway, after that first bit of music, we see that there is no tutorial this time. Guess they assumed that people would figure it out on their own, and honestly, it's not too hard to figure out. The design and UI were updated too, looking a bit more appropriate for a horror game now, but sacrificing some readability with that new font. And, probably the most important change, the on-screen arrow now moves faster. That must sound so random, but it makes navigation much smoother and backtracking, of which there is a lot if you don't know what to do, much less of a chore. Taking a look at the map, we immediately notice two things. One, nothing is marked on it. Neither your location, though it's pretty easy to see where you are, nor the status of the doors. And it stays this way for the entire game. Kind of a shame, seeing how the map is such an integral part of most Silent Hill games, including this one. It just feels like a bit of its identity was stripped away. And two, the elephant in the room. It doesn't look like a real map, more like a rough sketch you would make in Paint. And why are these dead ends a thing? There is literally nothing there. And why is the first floor split up like this? You can only access the left half with the stairs and the right half with the elevator from the second and third floor. That is so dumb. But at least every room is marked with something, unlike the second game, even if some aren't accessible, I guess. But really, this is supposed to be a mansion? I don't know. Map aside, the rooms themselves look really interesting, arguably the best designed rooms yet, but they are accompanied by some really bland and boring hallways. What is this series' problem with hallways? And you know what the worst thing is? The other world. The hallways are the exact same as in the normal world, and the differences in the rooms are really small, like blood on the walls. That was so disappointing. The first game had an amazing looking otherworld that felt incredibly faithful to the main games, and the second game's otherworld at least had some amazing looking rooms, but this one has nothing. Such a shame. The only real positive here, and it's a pretty big one, is that it always felt natural, never like a puzzle device, despite the switch happening manually again, with a symbol that I've never seen before. I love that. Overall, this game feels like a true finale. There are less puzzles than in the second one, and they're often really simple. Instead, we get more combat, with completely random feeling monster encounters, several monster designs, and a proper final boss. Pretty good for such a short game. It being less puzzle heavy and more focused on telling the end of the story and on the combat really makes it feel climatic at times. That, combined with the interesting story, twists, and surprising conclusion, makes for a really good final chapter. If you look stuff up, that is. Which I did. But if you don't, I wouldn't be surprised if you spend way too much time just mindlessly going through the rooms, because the game can be really bad at communicating what you have to do. So playing it without a guide would have made it pretty miserable, not gonna lie. But as is, it was a pretty enjoyable experience, with a length somewhere between the first two games, and I definitely liked it more than the second one. But the otherworld looks extremely lazy, and I like the first game's setting more. A mansion is cool, but an orphanage is just special, if you know what I mean. The map looked better in the first one, and I preferred the simple but mysterious story, which by now is still interesting, but neither simple nor mysterious. So my ranking would be Silent Hill Mobile 2 at the bottom, Mobile 3 in the middle, and Orphan on top. The last game I want to talk about today is Silent Hill the Arcade, and this is an interesting one because it's not a mobile game. It's a light gun shooter, like an actual arcade game. And you know what the most baffling thing is? It was co-developed by members of Team Silent, developers of the first 4 Silent Hill games, making this arguably the last game that Team Silent worked on, even if it's not all of them, and not only them. It's an hour-long experience that was never officially ported to any other platform, but a fan actually decided to port it to PC, and while there are problems with this version, I got it to work after a bit of tinkering. So thank you so much to whoever created it. The game itself is pretty easy to explain. You go through different locations and shoot enemies, both from the first 4 games. All movement is done by the game itself, except for a few branching paths, and you cannot pause it. You literally only shoot your pistol, or shotgun or rifle if you can find them. No manual reloading either, but honestly, the game does it so fast that I almost asked myself why it's there at all, or why it isn't there for the shotgun and rifle. That aside, we have one more gameplay feature, and that is the ability to play in co-op. There are multiple characters that travel together, more than 2 actually, and it made for an interesting dynamic. They can even die if you don't save them. But overall they don't influence much, aside from commenting on things during gameplay, which always reminded me that someone is there with me. That's pretty unique in the franchise. Most of the time you're completely alone in the other games. And the ability to play in co-op on top of that? I wish I could experience it at some point, because I can only imagine how that changes the dynamic. But is the fact that there are multiple characters reflected in the story at all? I'm glad you asked. The answer is yes. Kind of. The basic premise is that a group of friends is interested in one of the town's mysteries, one that's actually referenced in Silent Hill 2, so they go there and obviously get trapped. The mystery in question is about a ship that disappeared 75 years prior after a girl was thrown off of it and drowned. And you know what? One of the main characters is the great-grandson of that ship's captain. And while in the town, our group encounters a girl who looks just like the one who drowned. So what you got here is a surprisingly deep and twisted Silent Hill story. I'm not even joking, it was genuinely good. Of course, some things are inspired by other games in the series, like 2 important female characters looking the same. But that's all they are, inspirations. They make you go, huh, I recognize this. But not much more. The story itself is completely original and, much like other games, even ties into the world itself, with things like the ship's horn acting as the siren that announces the other world.
Hey, what happened? A boat whistle?
Like, they actually tried with this one. The only thing I can really criticize here is the bad ending, which is the one I got. It does a pretty bad job at explaining what the hell was even going on, but after reading and watching the other ones, there are a total of 4 by the way, I got it and was honestly fascinated by how much the developers were able to fit in here. Really, all things considered, this is a better story than some other games in this series, and I cannot stress enough how impressed I am by this, considering that this is just a 1-hour arcade game. This is exactly what I wished for in Silent Hill: The Escape, which is also just a mindless shooter. And on top of the interesting story, you also get some interesting locations. While you go through some of the best known ones, like the town itself or the mall from Silent Hill 3, you also have things like the endless staircase from Silent Hill 4 or the museum from Silent Hill 2. That made for a pretty unpredictable experience. I kept wondering where the game would take me next and often got it wrong. Silent Hill 1's elementary school or the subway station from Silent Hill 4 aren't included here, instead we get things like Silent Hill 2's labyrinth. The lack of transitions between most locations was a shame, usually you just teleport I guess, but I found the choice of locations fascinating, and it's the same with enemies. There are a bunch of different enemy types and bosses, including classics like the dog and Pyramid Head, but also ones you wouldn't expect, like these things from Silent Hill 4 or the Splitworm as a boss. So here too, they took some of the best known ones and mixed them in with some pretty obscure ones. That's just interesting. And on top of that, you also have original enemies, including Robbie the Rabbit? And 3 whole bosses that are very specific to this game's story, with interesting designs and some symbolism or actual plot relevance. So not only does this game look like Silent Hill, especially in the cutscenes, but the first-person perspective during gameplay gave it a very different vibe that I just loved. Can someone remake the first 4 games in first person, please? Thank you. It also sounds like Silent Hill. The music, the random little sounds, the trashy voice acting, everything is here. And then we also get the interesting story, of course, which ties into the world surprisingly well. Obviously, the town is based on the previous games, and some things don't make any sense here, like Pyramid Head or the Endless Staircase. Those are very specific to their respective games, and I would have preferred to just not have them here. But the things that are specific to this game, for the most part have a lot of meaning and would not work in any other Silent Hill game. I loved that. This 1-hour light gun shooter feels incredibly faithful to the series, also having things like locked doors with hidden keys and even a toilet with something inside. It really shows that the developers tried their best to provide an actual Silent Hill experience within this format that they chose for some reason. And I can't believe that I'm saying this right now, but it also feels more faithful to the series than some of the survival horror games did. It was an incredibly fun experience that didn't even feel like an hour. I swear it was over in like 20 minutes. Seeing how it's apparently still active in some locations, maybe I'll get the chance to play it on an actual arcade at some point. I would definitely love to, and honestly prefer that over playing this version again, because despite all the praise, this port is just not a great experience. I had to download extra software just to make it run for more than 5 minutes, and it's a 480p game that is stretched and locked to full screen, so it shifts everything else out of my screens. Meaning when I played it on stream, I actually had to open the stream on my phone to be able to read chat. Follow me on Twitch. And on top of that, if you tab out of the game, that's it. You're not getting back in. And tabbing out also happens if you accidentally click outside of the game, which is pretty easily done because my mouse feels much faster in this resolution and enemies appear on the edges a lot. No! I clicked outside of it. Ah, no. It luckily only happened once a few minutes in, but you could end up having to replay the whole thing right before the final boss. And this port also has a bug where if you skip a cutscene, the audio of it will still play over the gameplay. Understandable considering they were never meant to be skipped, but I'm just trying to say that this port, while functional, is far from perfect and actually prevents me from replaying the game, no matter how much fun I had with it. I would love to play this game more often, I really mean it, to explore all the branching paths and try to get higher scores with each playthrough, because it genuinely is a lot of fun. But that requires a good port of the game, not just a functional one. And port aside, there is one more thing that bothered me about this game. It kept switching to and from the other world way too much. Instead of letting it breathe and only switching every 10 minutes or so, this game switches back and forth all the time. I love both realms, and they are adapted beautifully in this game, but come on! By the way, random side note, there is no way that this bit from PT...
The father purchased the rifle used in the crime at his local gun store 2 days earlier. This brutal killing took place while the family was gathered at home on a Sunday afternoon.
...is not inspired by this bit from Silent Hill the arcade.
I just don't understand it at all.
Me neither. It feels like I'm losing it.
As the suspect for the murder-burglary which occurred in Silent Hill.
Overall, I had a lot of fun and I'm super glad that I was able to play it at all. Thank you so much once more to the person who ported it. I kept smiling throughout my playthrough and was super hyped about all the small things I saw. It was incredible to play an official, proper 3D Silent Hill game that I had never played before and that didn't suck. Like, it's been 12 years since we got a full game and even longer since the last good one. I cannot put into words how amazing it was to experience another somewhat cryptic story in this world with some actually fun gameplay. And the first-person perspective made for such an interesting change of pace too. It was amazing to see some of these locations in this perspective. Speaking objectively, this game is probably not the best thing ever, but this feeling of experiencing something new from a neglected franchise that I hold so dearly to my heart, and that feels so faithful to the franchise, is just unbeatable. I hope the upcoming games, as well as the short message, which I have yet to play, are good, because holy shit, we fans are Silent Hill deprived. And the arcade showed that it doesn't need a 10 out of 10. All it needs is a solid game and an interesting story. There are a few games I haven't mentioned, most notably plain novel Silent Hill. Judging by the YouTube views, it's probably more obscure than the arcade, but for some reason I always thought it was less obscure, and that the only truly obscure thing in there was the DLC chapter, for a 2001 Game Boy Advance game, that you had to leave the device on for or it would delete itself. Yeah, it's basically lost media at this point. And I think that's actually the only real video game I didn't talk about. There is also the PSP exclusive The Silent Hill Experience, but it's only a collection of things. Selected music from the first 4 games, a 5-issue comic series, a completely exclusive comic that has some animated bits and background music, music videos, trailers, interviews, and the joke endings from the first 2 games. So yeah, things. But again, not actually a game. Or what about the thing they announced only a few months after cancelling a masterpiece that people are still crying about even a decade later? The Pachinko Machine. Not a video game, but technically a game, so let's quickly go over it. It's just called Silent Hill, but serves as an adaptation of Silent Hill 2. Nice. But did you know that it got 2 sequels? Silent Hill Return, adapting the 3rd game, and Silent Hill Escape, adapting Downpour? And both of these came out on the same day. So now we have a game called Silent Hill The Escape and one called Silent Hill Escape. Nice. And that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this small series, because yes, I have another video planned, about a Silent Hill story even the most devoted fans might not have heard of. And it's a bit of a wild one, so I think it deserves its own video. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. And to kill the time until then, I post shorts about obscure things every few days. For example, did you know that there is a John Wick comic? Or an Alien Isolation sequel game? Or a Counter-Strike visual novel? Check out my shorts for these and more topics. Also, if you're planning to buy the Silent Hill 2 remake, why not do it on Humble Bundle and use my link for it? That way you pay the exact same as on Steam, but also support me financially. Link is in the description. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, or night, or whatever, and goodbye.